Shut your mouth and obey me!
A single slap echoed across a crowded intersection in Atlanta, and for one long, unbearable second, the entire street seemed to stop breathing. Cars idled mid-turn. Pedestrians froze on the crosswalk. A woman with a stroller clutched the handle tighter, unable to look away. The black woman standing beside the patrol car did not cry out. She did not stumble. She simply reached up, touched the corner of her lip, and looked down at the faint smear of blood on her fingertips, with an expression that unsettled everyone, watching more than tears ever could have. She said nothing about who she was. She made no threats, no pleas, no explanations. The officer standing over her exhaled through his nose and allowed himself a short, satisfied laugh, certain that he had just put an unruly civilian back in her place. He had no idea that 7 minutes later, the sky above that intersection would split open with the sound of rotor blades, that a convoy of military vehicles would come thundering down the avenue, and that more than 100 soldiers would snap to attention in perfect unison and shout words that would end his career before the sun went down. Attention, Colonel Zara Ellington on site. The afternoon had begun like any other quiet Tuesday in early autumn, the kind of day when the heat of summer had finally loosened its grip on Georgia and the leaves along Peachtree Street had just begun to turn at the edges. Zara Ellington guided her aging Silver Sport utility vehicle through the mid-afternoon traffic, her hands loose and relaxed on the wheel, her posture the kind of easy stillness that only comes from someone who has spent decades learning to control her own body under pressure. She was 45 years old, and though most strangers who passed her on the street would never have guessed it, she carried the rank of colonel in the United States Army, commanding a strategic logistics brigade that had coordinated supply lines and troop movements across multiple deployments in the Middle East. She had spent months away from home, buried in operations rooms lit by fluorescent light, tracking convoys and fuel reserves and the 1,000 invisible threads that keep an army fed, armed, and moving. Now, she was finally on a rare 3-day leave, and she had promised herself nothing more ambitious than driving across town to visit her sister and eat a home-cooked meal that did not come from a ration pack or a mess hall tray. There was nothing about her appearance that afternoon to suggest her rank or her career. She wore a plain white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to her forearms and a well-worn pair of blue jeans, comfortable and unremarkable, the kind of outfit chosen for comfort rather than presentation. She carried no insignia, no dog tags visible above her collar, no military identification clipped to her belt, the way some career officers habitually displayed even off-duty. Zara had never been the type to announce her rank to strangers. She believed, quietly and firmly, that a person's character should stand on its own, without the weight of a title propping it up, and so on her days off, she moved through the world exactly as any other woman might, unnoticed and unbothered, which was precisely how she preferred it. Her SUV was 7 years old, its paint a little faded along the hood, a small dent near the rear bumper that she had never bothered to fix, because it did not affect how the vehicle drove. She liked it that way. She had never seen the point in flash. Zara had grown up in a small town outside Savannah, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a mechanic, raised in a household where discipline and quiet self-respect were treated as inseparable virtues, taught long before she ever put on a uniform. She had enlisted young, driven less by ambition than by a simple, stubborn desire to prove that she could carry weight. Others assumed she could not, and over more than 2 decades, she had risen through the ranks the hard way, earning every promotion through performance rather than favor. She had no husband waiting for her at home, no children counting down the days until she returned, only a small apartment near the base, a handful of close friends scattered across different units, and a sister across town whose kitchen table had become, over the years, the closest thing she had to a permanent anchor. She rarely spoke about the details of her deployments, not out of secrecy, but out of the particular exhaustion that comes from having explained the unexplainable too many times to people who could never truly understand it. And so she had learned instead to carry her history quietly, folded away beneath an ordinary exterior that asked nothing of anyone and revealed nothing unless it truly mattered. A few blocks away, on the same stretch of road she would soon be traveling, Officer Travis Monroe sat in his cruiser at a checkpoint he had set up under the pretense of a routine safety inspection. Monroe had been with the department for nearly 9 years, and in that time he had built a reputation that his supervisors quietly acknowledged but had never quite acted upon. There had been complaints filed against him before, more than a dozen over the years, citizens alleging that he escalated minor stops into confrontations, that he searched vehicles without cause, that he spoke to people, especially people who did not look like him, with a contempt that had no place in professional policing. None of those complaints had ever resulted in real consequences. A note in a file here, a verbal warning there, and then Monroe would be back on the street the following week, badge polished, attitude unchanged. That afternoon he was irritable before his shift had even properly begun, frustrated by a supervisor who had criticized his paperwork that morning, and looking, whether he admitted it to himself or not, for someone on whom to unload that frustration. Monroe had joined the force in his mid-20s, drawn less by any real sense of civic duty than by the appeal of authority itself, by the particular thrill of a uniform that made other people yield the moment he approached. Colleagues who had worked alongside him described him, when pressed years later, as a man who treated every stop as a contest he intended to win, who seemed to measure the success of a shift, not by the safety of the streets, but by how thoroughly he had asserted control over the people he encountered. He had cultivated, over the years, a talent for phrasing his reports in ways that made his conduct sound justified, even when witnesses recalled the encounters very differently, a talent that had shielded him more than once from consequences that should rightly have ended his career long before that autumn afternoon. When Zara's SUV rolled toward the checkpoint, Monroe's eyes moved over the vehicle with the practiced, dismissive scan of a man who had already decided what he was looking at before he had gathered a single fact. An older car with a small dent, a woman driving alone, a black woman, calm and unbothered, meeting his gaze through the windshield without the nervous deference he seemed to expect. Something in that composure irritated him instantly, though he would not have been able to explain why, and he raised his hand and waved her toward the shoulder of the road with more force than the gesture required. Zara complied without hesitation, easing her vehicle to the curb exactly as instructed, her movements smooth and unhurried, the same discipline she brought to every task in her life, whether it was coordinating a battalion's fuel supply or pulling over for a traffic stop on a quiet afternoon. She had no reason to expect trouble. She had done nothing wrong. But as Monroe approached her window with his hand resting near his belt, and his jaw set in a hard, humorless line, some old and reliable instinct in the back of her mind, the same instinct that had kept her alive through convoy ambushes and hostile checkpoints overseas, told her that this encounter was not going to be simple. Monroe stepped up to her window, and instead of the usual greeting, he barked at her to step out of the vehicle, his voice sharp enough that two people waiting at a nearby bus stop turned to look. There was no explanation offered, no clear violation cited, only the raw command of a man who had decided, before a single word had passed between them, exactly how this interaction was going to unfold, and exactly who was going to be made to feel small in the process. Zara stepped out slowly, her hands visible, her expression unreadable, and stood on the pavement, while Monroe circled her vehicle like a man hunting for something he had already convinced himself he would find. He demanded her license and registration, and she produced both without protest, her documents perfectly in order, her insurance current, her registration valid down to the day. He studied the papers for far longer than they required, flipping them over, as though searching for some hidden flaw, his frustration visibly mounting with every second that passed without him finding a single thing wrong. Cars slowed as they passed the shoulder, drivers craning their necks, a few pulling out their phones, out of instinct more than intention, sensing that something about the scene did not sit right, even before they understood what was happening. Unable to find fault with her paperwork, Monroe shifted his approach entirely, demanding that she open her trunk, empty her bag, and hand over her phone for inspection, framing each request as though it were standard procedure rather than the escalating overreach it actually was. Zara, calm but firm, declined the search, explaining evenly that he had no legal basis to examine her belongings without cause, and that she was well within her rights to refuse. It was not defiance for its own sake. It was the simple, steady assertion of a woman who understood the law far better than the man standing in front of her, who had spent years navigating rules of engagement, protocols, and chains of command far more complex than a municipal traffic code, and who was not going to be bullied into surrendering rights she knew she possessed. Her refusal, calm as it was, seemed to strike Monroe as a personal insult, and something in his posture shifted, his shoulders squaring, his jaw tightening further, the muscles along his neck standing out with tension he was no longer bothering to conceal. By now, a small crowd had gathered along the sidewalk, drawn by the raised voice, the flashing lights, the sight of a uniformed officer looming over a woman who had done nothing more than assert a right the law had already given her. Several bystanders lifted their phones, recording quietly, some out of concern, some out of the reflexive habit of documenting anything that felt like it might matter later. Monroe noticed the phones, and rather than de-escalating, he seemed to feel the pressure of the watching eyes as a challenge, an audience in front of which he now felt he stepped closer, well past the distance that any reasonable officer would maintain during a calm exchange, his voice rising, accusing her of resisting a lawful order, though nothing about his original request had ever been lawful in the first place. Zara did not step back. She held her ground, her eyes steady, her voice never rising to match his, and it was precisely that stillness, that refusal to be provoked into a reaction he could later use to justify himself, that seemed to enrage him even further, pushing him toward a decision that would unravel his career within the hour. Without warning, Monroe reached out and snatched the phone from Zara's hand, the one she had lifted, calmly and without threat, simply to check the time, his fingers closing around it with unnecessary force as he barked at her not to record him. Though she had made no move to do so, Zara's expression did not change. She did not flinch, did not raise her voice, did not reach to reclaim the device, and that composure, that absolute refusal to give him the reaction he wanted, seemed to strip away the last thread of his self-control. He shouted at her, his voice cracking with something between fury and panic, warning her not to defy his commands, though she had defied nothing beyond a search that the law itself did not permit him to conduct. And then, in front of dozens of witnesses, with phones raised and recording from at least 6 different angles along the sidewalk, Officer Travis Monroe slapped Colonel Zara Ellington hard across the face. The sound cracked through the intersection like a gunshot, and for a moment, nobody moved. A man near the bus stop actually gasped aloud. The woman with the stroller pulled her child closer, without thinking. Zara's head turned slightly with the force of the blow, her phone clattering to the pavement and skidding beneath the front tire of a parked car. And yet in the silence that followed, she did not cry out, did not stagger, did not reach for her cheek in the wounded, instinctive way that anyone watching might have expected. She simply stood there, absorbing the moment with the same unnerving stillness she had carried since the stop began, while every single witness on that sidewalk understood, in their bones, that they had just seen something they were never supposed to see. Nobody stepped forward to intervene. Fear held the crowd in place. The same fear that keeps ordinary people frozen in the presence of a uniform and a weapon, even when every instinct screams that what is happening is deeply, undeniably wrong. The phones kept recording. Nobody spoke above a whisper. And then, into that ringing silence, Zara finally spoke, her voice quiet, level, almost gentle, carrying none of the anger the moment seemed to demand. She asked him, simply, whether he was certain he wanted to continue down this path, whether this was truly the hill he wished to plant his flag on, and something in the calm precision of the question should have frightened him far more than it did. Instead, Monroe laughed, a short, ugly sound, convinced that he had just reminded a defiant civilian exactly where the power in this exchange resided, utterly blind to the fact that the woman standing before him, blood at the corner of her lip, had commanded logistics for military operations spanning entire regions, and that the true weight of consequence was already, at that very moment, beginning to move toward him. Zara reached down without hurry and lifted a second phone from the inside pocket of her jeans, a phone Monroe had not even known she carried, its case scuffed and worn in the particular way of a device that had traveled through deserts and command tents and forward operating bases far from anything resembling an ordinary American street. She did not dial with trembling fingers. She did not call for a lawyer, did not scroll through contacts searching for help, did not display a single flicker of panic. She pressed a single number held the phone to her uninjured ear, and when the line connected, she spoke exactly one sentence, her voice flat and precise, the kind of voice that had issued commands across static-filled radio channels in far more dangerous places than this. Protocol Iron Falcon. Location confirmed. Then she ended the call and slid the phone back into her pocket, as though she had just ordered a cup of coffee. Monroe watched the exchange with something close to amusement, certain in his own mind that she was calling a lawyer, or perhaps a relative, some desperate attempt to summon help that would arrive far too late to matter, if it arrived at all. He kept her detained at the scene regardless, unwilling to let the moment end on anything but his own terms, ordering her to remain by the vehicle, while he filled out paperwork he had not bothered to justify from the very beginning. A younger officer who had arrived moments earlier as backup stood nearby, visibly uneasy, his eyes flicking between Monroe and the silent, composed woman standing at the roadside, a woman whose calm now struck him as far more unsettling than any outburst could have been. The younger officer, still new enough to the job that his instincts had not yet been worn down into obedience, quietly asked Monroe whether they ought to notify a supervisor about what had just happened, given the number of witnesses, given the way the encounter had escalated. Monroe waved the suggestion away with the same careless contempt he had shown for everything else that afternoon, insisting there was nothing to report, that he had handled an uncooperative subject exactly the way the situation demanded, and that the young officer would do well to stop second-guessing men with more experience than himself. But even as the words left his mouth, something in the distance had already begun to change. Miles away, at a military installation on the outskirts of the city, an alarm cut through the quiet hum of a Tuesday afternoon, sharp and insistent, the kind of alert that soldiers train for but rarely expect to actually hear outside of drills. In the command center, a duty officer straightened instantly in his chair as a code flashed across his monitor, a code that every person in that building had been trained to recognize immediately and without question, a code tied directly to the safety of a senior officer in the field. Within seconds, the room around him had transformed, chairs scraping back, voices rising in clipped, urgent bursts, phones lifted to ears as the machinery of a well-drilled military response began turning at full speed. Colonel Zara Ellington had just sent an emergency distress signal, and no one in that command center needed to be told twice what that meant. There was no debate, no hesitation, no committee convened to weigh options. The moment her authentication code registered on the system, protocol took over entirely, sweeping aside anything as trivial as caution or delay, because when a colonel with her record activates a personal distress signal, the assumption is never that the situation is minor. Within minutes, the brigade's rapid response element had been mobilized, armored Humvees rolling out of their motor pool with practiced urgency, military police vehicles falling into formation behind them, engines roaring to life across the base, in a coordinated surge that any bystander would have mistaken for the opening moments of a full-scale exercise. Overhead, the unmistakable thrum of rotor blades began to build, as a Black Hawk helicopter lifted off from the base's landing pad, cutting a hard course toward the coordinates that had come through with Zara's signal. A brigadier general, alerted the moment the distress call registered, arrived in the command center still adjusting his uniform, and after a single glance at the screen, he did not ask for details, did not request clarification, did not pause to consider the political optics of sending an armed convoy into the middle of a civilian city. He simply gave the order that every soldier in that room had been waiting for. Move now. The convoy tore out of the base gates in a formation so tight and disciplined, it looked almost choreographed. Sirens silent, but lights flashing. The low growl of diesel engines rising into a roar as the vehicles merged onto the highway leading toward the city center. Drivers on the road that afternoon pulled aside instinctively, some out of confusion, some out of the primal recognition that whatever was happening, it demanded immediate deference. In the distance, faint at first but growing steadily louder, the sound of rotor blades began to reach the intersection where Zara still stood, patient and unbothered, waiting for the machinery she had set in motion to arrive exactly as she knew it would. Back at the scene, pedestrians who had lingered to watch the aftermath of the slap began glancing skyward, drawn by a sound that did not belong to the ordinary rhythm of city traffic, a deep, mechanical thrum that grew steadily louder with each passing second. Someone in the crowd pointed upward, and within moments, 3 military helicopters emerged over the skyline, flying in a tight, deliberate formation that made it immediately clear this was no accident of routing, no coincidental flyover unrelated to the scene below. Behind them, at street level, a convoy of military vehicles turned onto the avenue, engines rumbling. The sheer scale of the response silencing every conversation along the sidewalk almost instantly. Monroe felt the first genuine flicker of unease settle into his chest, though he fought against it, telling himself that whatever this was, it surely had nothing to do with him, that soldiers did not deploy in force over a routine traffic stop, that there had to be some other explanation entirely unrelated to the woman still standing quietly beside her vehicle. He clung to that thought, even as the convoy slowed, then stopped, directly at the intersection, even as doors began opening in rapid, synchronized succession, even as uniformed figures began pouring out onto the pavement, with the kind of precision that left no room for doubt about their purpose. A senior officer, a full colonel serving as the base's provost marshal, stepped down from the lead vehicle first, his eyes scanning the scene until they found Zara, and the moment they locked onto her, his posture shifted instantly, snapping into a crisp, formal salute that radiated respect rather than mere procedure. Behind him, soldier after soldier fell into position along the street, boots striking pavement in unison, until more than 100 uniformed personnel stood in disciplined formation, their eyes forward, their bodies rigid, with the kind of respect that cannot be faked or ordered into existence through fear alone. And then, in a single thunderous voice that seemed to shake the very air of the intersection, the assembled soldiers called out her name and ranked together, the words rolling across the street with a force that silenced every last murmur among the watching crowd. Colonel Zara Ellington. The words hung in the air like a verdict already rendered, and in that instant, the entire scene seemed to freeze, drivers abandoning their vehicles mid-lane to stare, bystanders lowering their phones, not out of fear now, but out of sheer astonishment, the crowd realizing all at once that they had witnessed something far larger than a simple act of police cruelty. Monroe's face drained of color so completely that the younger officer beside him actually reached out, instinctively, as though to steady him should his knees give way beneath him. The notebook he had been holding, the one he had used to scribble a citation against a woman who had committed no violation, slipped from his fingers and fell to the pavement, its pages fluttering open in the light breeze, forgotten and utterly irrelevant against the magnitude of what was unfolding around him. Moments later, the brigadier general himself arrived, stepping out of a following vehicle with the unmistakable bearing of a man accustomed to command, and he crossed the intersection directly toward Zara, without a single glance spared for anyone else present. He extended his hand, and she took it, and the handshake between them, brief and formal though it was, communicated more to the stunned crowd than any speech could have, confirming beyond all doubt that the woman standing at the center of this scene, blood still faintly visible at the corner of her mouth, held a position of genuine, significant authority. It was only then, as murmurs began rippling through the gathered onlookers, that the true scope of who Zara Ellington actually was began to surface among the crowd, passed from mouth to mouth in hushed, disbelieving tones. She was not simply an officer of modest rank, caught up in an unfortunate misunderstanding. She commanded a strategic logistics brigade, responsible for supply lines that had sustained thousands of troops across multiple deployments overseas. She had been awarded numerous decorations by the Department of Defense for meritorious service under conditions that few civilians could ever fully comprehend. She had, on more than one occasion, made decisions under fire that had directly preserved the lives of soldiers under her command, coordinating extractions and resupply missions through hostile territory with a steadiness that had become something of a quiet legend among those who had served alongside her. She served as a senior strategic advisor on logistics operations at the highest levels, her judgment trusted by commanders who did not extend that trust easily. The crowd's astonishment deepened with every detail that emerged, disbelief giving way to something closer to reverence, as people who moments earlier had merely watched a disturbing scene now understood they had witnessed the mistreatment of a woman who had spent her career protecting others, standing quietly and enduring an assault, rather than revealing the power she could have summoned instantly had she chosen to announce herself the moment Monroe first raised his voice. Somewhere in that crowd, A phone live stream that had begun as a simple act of documentation was already climbing toward audiences, numbering in the millions, the raw footage of the slap, and the astonishing military response that followed, spreading outward across the country with a speed that no press release could ever have matched. Strangers who had never met Zara Ellington, and never would, began speaking about her as though they somehow understood exactly what had passed through her mind in that instant. Some praising her restraint as the very definition of grace under pressure, others quietly wondering aloud what it must have cost a person to stand still through such humiliation rather than let anger take its natural course. News vans began arriving at the intersection within the hour, reporters weaving between the parked military vehicles in search of anyone willing to describe what they had seen, while further back, curious residents who had heard the commotion from blocks away drifted toward the scene simply to confirm with their own eyes that the stories already circulating through their phones were, impossibly, entirely true. By nightfall, the footage had reached television broadcasts as far away as the West Coast, anchors reading updates about an Army colonel struck by a local officer with an expression of genuine disbelief, as though even they could scarcely accept that such a scene had unfolded in broad daylight on an ordinary American street. Monroe stood frozen amid the soldiers now, his hands trembling faintly at his sides, his earlier bravado utterly extinguished, replaced by the hollow, sinking realization that he had struck a decorated military officer in front of dozens of witnesses and an untold number of recording devices, an act with consequences he could not begin to calculate. He opened his mouth as though to speak, some fumbling attempt at explanation or apology forming behind his eyes, but no words came out that made any coherent sense. Zara, for her part, remained utterly composed, her attention fixed not on the man who had struck her but on the larger scene now unfolding around them, her mind already turning toward the process that would follow, methodical and unhurried, exactly as it always had been in every crisis she had ever managed. The brigadier general, after a brief, quiet exchange with Zara, turned his attention toward Monroe and the young officer standing beside him, and requested, in a tone that made clear it was not truly a request at all, that the department's body camera footage from the encounter be made available immediately. Monroe's supervisor, alerted by then and rushing to the scene himself, arrived just in time to hear the demand, and after a single glance at the assembled military presence and the sea of recording phones surrounding the intersection, he did not hesitate to comply. The footage was pulled up on a tablet screen right there at the roadside, and as it played, frame by frame, the entire sequence of events became undeniable to everyone present, stripped of any ambiguity that might otherwise have muddied the record. There was Monroe waving Zara to the shoulder without cause. There was his voice, sharp and unjustified, ordering her from the vehicle. There was the search he had demanded, without any legal basis, her calm and lawful refusal, his escalating fury, and finally, unmistakably, his open hand, striking her face in full view of the camera, mounted to his own uniform. Nothing about the footage left room for interpretation or excuse. Several bystanders who had recorded the incident from their own angles stepped forward voluntarily, offering their footage as well, their accounts aligning perfectly with what the body camera had already revealed, forming a wall of corroborating evidence that no explanation Monroe might have offered could possibly overcome. Word of the incident reached the police department's internal affairs division within the hour, and investigators were dispatched to the scene almost immediately, moving with an urgency rarely afforded to complaints of this nature. Driven by the sheer scale of public and military attention the case had already attracted, Monroe was informed, right there on the street, that his firearm and badge were being taken into custody pending a full investigation, and that he was suspended from duty effective immediately, a fall from authority so swift and total that it seemed to physically diminish him in front of the crowd that had watched him strike an innocent woman only an hour before. He attempted, in a voice that had lost every trace of its earlier arrogance, to offer some form of apology directly to Zara, stumbling over words that clearly had never been rehearsed for a moment like this one. Zara looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and said nothing at all, her silence carrying more weight than any accusation could have. As the internal affairs investigation deepened over the following hours, investigators uncovered a pattern that had apparently gone unaddressed for years, a trail of prior complaints against Monroe stretching back nearly a decade, allegations of unnecessary force, unlawful searches, and demeaning treatment of civilians that had somehow never resulted in meaningful discipline. Each complaint, reviewed in isolation, had perhaps seemed manageable, explainable, forgivable within the ordinary margins of a difficult job. But laid out together, side by side, in the wake of an incident that the entire country was now watching unfold on their screens, the pattern painted an unmistakable picture of an officer who had been allowed, again and again, to escalate encounters that should never have escalated at all. In the days that followed, the story spread far beyond the confines of the city, dominating national news coverage and prompting public officials at every level to respond. Several individuals who had previously filed complaints against Monroe came forward publicly for the first time, encouraged by the overwhelming evidence now available and by the visible support Zara's case had generated, describing encounters eerily similar to the one caught on camera at that intersection. Journalists dug deeper into departmental records, revealing internal memos that had flagged Monroe's conduct as early as 3 years prior, memos that had apparently been filed away and forgotten rather than acted upon. The mayor of the city held a press conference within 48 hours, flanked by the chief of police and, notably, by representatives from the military installation whose soldiers had responded to the scene, each of them addressing the incident with a gravity that reflected just how significant the fallout had become. The police chief announced that Monroe would face formal criminal charges related to the assault, alongside termination from the department, a decision that came far more swiftly than such proceedings ordinarily unfolded, driven in no small part by the undeniable weight of video evidence and the intense scrutiny now surrounding the case. Legal analysts who appeared on national broadcasts in the days following the announcement noted that cases of this nature rarely moved with such speed, and several pointed out, some approvingly and others with open skepticism, that the involvement of the military and the sheer volume of public attention had almost certainly accelerated a process that might otherwise have stretched on for months or simply faded away entirely. Community organizers who had spent years advocating for stronger oversight of local police conduct expressed a complicated mixture of relief and frustration, grateful that consequences had finally arrived, yet troubled by the implication that accountability had only become possible because the victim happened to hold significant rank and influence. It was a tension that would follow the case long after Monroe's trial concluded, a quiet, persistent question about whether justice delivered so swiftly for one person could ever truly be called justice if it remained so difficult to secure for everyone else. Beyond Monroe himself, several supervisors within the department who had reviewed and dismissed his earlier complaints without proper investigation found themselves facing disciplinary review as well, the entire chain of oversight that had failed to stop him, now subject to the same unflinching examination that had exposed his conduct in the first place. It became clear, in the weeks that followed, that this was no longer simply the story of one officer's failure, but a broader reckoning with how such failures had been allowed to accumulate unchecked for years. Through it all, Zara conducted herself with the same quiet discipline that had defined her throughout the encounter itself, declining every offer of special treatment or accelerated legal remedy that her rank and connections might easily have afforded her. She insisted that her case proceed through exactly the same channels available to any ordinary citizen who might find themselves in a similar situation, refusing any suggestion that her military standing should grant her privileges denied to others. When reporters pressed her for interviews in the days immediately following the incident, she declined nearly all of them, offering only a brief, carefully worded statement through a public affairs officer, a statement whose brevity did nothing to diminish the impact of the single line at its center. No one else should have to go through this. As the investigation moved forward and the legal proceedings against Monroe began to take shape, Zara found herself, somewhat reluctantly, transformed into a public figure whose story had come to represent something far larger than her own individual experience. Advocacy organizations reached out requesting her involvement in campaigns addressing police accountability. Elected officials cited her case in speeches calling for reform of internal review processes. Ordinary citizens, moved by the footage that had circulated so widely, wrote to her directly, sharing their own encounters with officers who had abused their authority, encounters that had never received the attention or consequence that hers eventually had. Zara read many of these messages personally, setting aside time between her military obligations to respond where she could, understanding on some fundamental level that her silence in the moment of the slap and her composure in the days that followed had somehow given voice to countless others whose own stories had gone unheard. Eventually, as the legal process against Monroe moved toward its conclusion, with formal charges filed and a trial date set, Zara agreed to make one public statement before the press, standing at a podium set up outside the city courthouse, dressed once again in the simple, unadorned manner she preferred, though this time her uniform hung nearby, a quiet acknowledgement of who she was without the need to wear it as armor. The crowd that gathered that day was larger than anyone had anticipated, reporters from national outlets standing shoulder to shoulder with ordinary residents who had simply wanted to see, in person, the woman whose composure had become something of a symbol in the weeks since the incident. She began speaking without notes, her voice carrying the same measured calm that had defined her throughout the entire ordeal. And she told the assembled crowd, plainly and without embellishment, that authority granted by a badge or a uniform did not place any individual above the law that governed everyone else. She reminded them that a uniform, whether military or civilian, was never the true source of honor. That honor, instead, was earned through the way a person treated those who held less power in any given moment, particularly those who could not easily defend themselves. She noted, with a quiet gravity that seemed to settle over the entire crowd, that on the day of the incident, the person struck without cause had happened to be a colonel with the full weight of a military command behind her, someone whose story could not simply be buried or dismissed. But she reminded them, just as firmly, that tomorrow the person standing in that same position might be anyone at all: a mother, a student, a retiree, someone with no rank, no title, and no convoy of soldiers to summon in their defense. The crowd, silent through most of her remarks, broke into sustained applause as she finished, many in the audience rising to their feet, moved by words that had carried none of the anger the moment might have justified, only a steady, unwavering insistence on decency as the true measure of authority. Several officers standing at the edges of the gathered crowd, present in an official capacity to help manage the event, were seen lowering their heads, whether in shame, reflection, or simple respect. It was difficult for observers to say with certainty, though the gesture did not go unnoticed by those nearby. The brigadier general who had led the response that day stood near the podium as she finished speaking, and as she stepped back from the microphone, he offered her one final, formal salute, a gesture that seemed to carry within it not just military protocol, but a genuine, personal acknowledgement of everything she had endured and everything she had chosen not to become in the process. Zara returned the salute briefly, then turned away from the cameras and the crowd, declining the microphone that reporters continued to thrust toward her, declining every follow-up question shouted after her as she walked toward the edge of the courthouse steps. She made her way to the parking area, where her vehicle waited, and to the visible surprise of several onlookers who perhaps expected some grander departure, some military escort befitting her rank and the scale of attention her story had received, she simply climbed into the same aging silver sport utility vehicle she had been driving on the afternoon. Everything began, the small dent still visible near the rear bumper, unchanged and unrepaired. She started the engine, pulled carefully out of the lot, and merged into traffic exactly as she had done countless times before, seeking no further recognition, no lasting spotlight, no interviews that might extend her moment of unwanted fame any longer than circumstances had already demanded. In the months that followed, Officer Travis Monroe stood trial for the assault, the overwhelming body of evidence, from his own body camera footage to the testimony of dozens of witnesses, leaving little room for any outcome other than conviction. He lost his position permanently. His career in law enforcement ended entirely, and the pattern of prior misconduct uncovered during the investigation ensured that no other department within the state would ever again grant him a badge. The department itself underwent significant internal reform in the aftermath. New oversight procedures put in place specifically to prevent the kind of repeated, unaddressed complaints that had allowed a single officer to accumulate nearly a decade of misconduct before facing any real consequence. An independent review board was established within months, staffed in part by civilians from outside the department, tasked specifically with examining any complaint that had been dismissed without a formal hearing, a reform that several city council members credited directly to the public pressure generated in the weeks following the intersection incident. Training programs across the department were revised as well, with new modules addressing de-escalation and the legal limits of search authority, though critics were quick to note that policy changes on paper meant little without genuine cultural change inside the ranks that enforced them. Still, for the first time in years, officers who had once watched colleagues like Monroe operate with near total impunity began to see, in real time, that consequences could actually follow misconduct, a shift, subtle enough to escape headlines, but significant enough that several veteran officers later admitted, privately, that it had changed the way they approached even the most routine encounters on the street. For Colonel Zara Ellington, life continued much as it had before that afternoon at the intersection, her days filled once again with the demanding, unglamorous work of managing logistics across a strategic command, the same discipline and quiet competence that had defined her long before a single slap made her, however briefly and however unwillingly, a name known across the country. She never sought to capitalize on the attention her story had generated, never wrote a book about the experience, never appeared on the extended circuit of interviews and speaking engagements that so often follows a moment of public reckoning. She returned, as she always had, to the work itself, understanding perhaps better than most that the truest measure of a person is rarely found in a single dramatic moment, but rather in everything that comes quietly afterward, in the choices made when no camera is present and no crowd is watching. Her sister, whose kitchen table Zara had originally set out to reach that afternoon, would later say that when Zara finally arrived, hours later than planned, bruised faintly along one cheek but otherwise unchanged, she said almost nothing about what had happened, choosing instead to sit down at the table exactly as she had intended to all along, asking only whether dinner was still warm. It was, her sister recalled, such a small and ordinary request that it took a moment to understand just how extraordinary the composure behind it truly was. That a woman who had spent the afternoon struck in public and surrounded by a mobilized military response could still walk through a familiar door and ask, simply, whether there was food on the stove. That quiet, unremarkable homecoming, more than any speech delivered outside a courthouse, seemed to capture something essential about who Zara Ellington really was, a woman for whom composure was never a performance, but simply the ordinary shape of her character, present whether the world was watching or not. And somewhere, still circulating occasionally through the endless churn of shared footage online, the original recording remained, beginning always the same way, with the sharp, unmistakable crack of a hand against a face, and the stillness of a woman who chose, in that instant, not to react with anger, but with something far harder to summon and far more difficult to forget. The footage would inevitably cut, in the versions that continued to circulate, to the moment that followed 7 minutes later, the image of more than 100 soldiers standing in perfect formation, their voices rising together in a single thunderous declaration of her name and rank, a moment that had come to represent, for countless people who watched it, something larger than any one incident on any one street corner. It stood as a reminder that true strength was never a matter of rank or title or the machinery one could summon in a moment of crisis, but rather the quiet, unshakable choice to hold on to one's own dignity, even when someone else was doing everything in their power to strip it away.